Stow Great War Aerodrome. Ian here, and on behalf of the curatorial team, another one of those videos that keeps popping up in your feed. We've talked about a number of things over the last couple of videos, but I thought it might be worthwhile having a chat about how we took the war to the enemy in the Great War. Stow Great War Aerodrome was involved indirectly with taking the war to the enemy, but actually it was more involved in defence. Two of the objects we've got here to look at will hopefully put a bit of colour into that picture. They're both from the Flower and Beaumont collection, and we're really welcoming and glad to those loaners to letting us keep hold of these so I can share them with you. So, without further ado, let's look at the first object. Now, to put this object into context, when you think about the modern pilot, you imagine that pilot in a green overall with a see-through pocket on each one of his thighs or her thighs. And on the top of that, often you will scratch notes using a chinograph pencil. This enables you to have a method of marking. Now, alongside that, you might have a map. It's more likely with modern aircraft that you'll have a digital map, but all the way through history there has been needs for maps within the cockpit. And this is a map scroll. So in the Great War, you would have had this to help you use your map. You can see that it was wrist mounted. There's the leather strap there. And over a bulky flight suit, this would have been mounted on the forearm. The key part of it is these two cylinders and this flat panel here. The two cylinders would have the map rolled around with the flat portion of your operational area ready for you to look at. And you would advance it or retard it, move it backwards, using these two knurled knobs on those scroll points. To help you in using the map, you have a compass here with the various minute directions, and that gives you direction of travel. And down at the bottom here, you can see there is a scale, so you can get an idea of how far you are travelling, but more importantly, how far from the target area on your map that the rounds you are seeing falling are actually going. Let's remember that at the initial part of the war, the job of the aircraft was an artillery spotter or a reconnaissance. That was what they did. So as you were watching the artillery barrage, you could make plots using your map on how effective, in so much as how close to the target, the artillery rounds being fired from behind you and often straight over your head were actually being. If you were a pilot, of course, on your own, then you could use the pilot's joystick and other controls in the aircraft with this and no impedance. If you were an observer or gunner in the rear of the aircraft or the front of the aircraft with the pilot stationed elsewhere, for instance the BE-2Es that flew from Stow, you would have this on the forearm in the same way, but you could also pull it up to have a look at this protractor here to give a firmer idea of where those artillery rounds were falling. At the beginning of the war, you would then make a note on a pad, drop it in a message streamer back behind your own lines. Later in the war, you would use the Morse cipher and communications and a clock face plan to really plot where those rounds were falling. And that was the way aircraft initially took the war to the enemy. The idea that the aircraft were used for air-to-air combat, killing individual pilots or crews, really is something that happens later. At the first part of the war, we're looking at causing huge amounts of damage by spotting accurately with artillery. Of course, air-to-air combat is one method of delivering ordnance to the enemy. The other way is from aerial bombardment. And here is an example of the ordnance that was used in that particular method. This one is a British bomb. This is about 15 to 20 pounds depending on the load. The frame would carry both. It's uniquely a English or British ordnance because it's got the rounded head. Most of the English ones had rounded points here, the nose. The German ones were more likely to have a conical one. Not exclusively, but often. You can see access here to the internal load. Could have been amatol or any high explosive, and also that gives restricted access to the fuse. Here we see a mounting point for this to go under the fuselage of the aircraft. Not like today where we have them mounted on the wings normally, or majority anyway. The strongest part of the fuselage, the strongest part of the aircraft was the fuselage, and therefore that's where we mounted them. it would be secured using this and to a certain extent the end ring as well. You can see the classic shape there that we all recognise. This one is marked very carefully here, 1916, and it's a Hales patent. That isn't the bomb itself, that's the method of control, these fins. This is very much a work in progress. You can see that that includes this one on the top. There's the maker's mark there, the cube of HLD on here. But this is not just to spin for fun. This was a method of detonating the charge. Worked out to as close as possible, so many spins, once this was dropped, would ignite the fuse and cause the ordnance to explode. One didn't want the bombs dropping off on takeoff and blowing you out of the sky just as you took off, so they needed to be made safe until they were such a distance from the aircraft and therefore ready to drop on the targets below. Bombs like this, including the ones that the Germans operated, caused massive devastation, not just to the armed forces, but also to the domestic houses and homes of the people fighting the war. So back in the home counties, in the east of England, and most devastatingly the capital in London, we were on the receiving end of the German versions of these heavily, particularly during Operation Turk's Cross. That's where Stow Maris Great War Aerodrome comes in, because it was our job to take off from Stow Maris and try and defeat initially the Zeppelins that were dropping these and bombs like it, and also the fixed wings that followed it, the Gotha and the Starken bombers. Terrible weapon, whichever side used it. I think that just about covers it for me. We don't want this to go on too long. Hopefully it's been interesting. Once again, really, really glad, and thanks to Flower and Beaumont, the two gentlemen who loaned us this. We're very, very glad. These will be on display, ready for you to look at when we reopen. Until such times, I hope this has been interesting, and I'll talk to you again soon.